Hello, thank you so much for joining us today for an author Q&A with the wonderful Chris Cillizza, and thank you to the National Archives for hosting this event. As many of you know, Chris has covered Washington, D.C. politics for 4 decades. Don't want to date you there, Chris.
Makes me feel old.
Yeah. You started as a tiny little kid.
Exactly, I was 10.
You worked at CNN, Roll Call, the Washington Post, of course, and your new book, Power Players, Sports, Politics, and the American Presidency, is a fascinating read. I really enjoyed it. It's fun, and I learned a lot about presidents and what sports they enjoy and what it says about them. So
Well, thank you, and thank you for doing this. I really appreciate it. As someone who knows the White House and politics intimately, I appreciate you bringing your perspective to it.
Well, of course. We also go back a long time. So
yes, we do.
Yes. So, the question you always get asked as an author is what made you want to write this book? What is it? What's so special about this topic to you?
Well, so I don't know if it's the same for you, but honestly, it was selfish, at least at the start. When I abandoned my dreams of making the NBA at about age 14 or 15, I can't remember exactly when that was, but when I realized I was unlikely to be a professional basketball player, I realized I had to do something else with my life. And journalism was the thing that kind of jumped out. I always assumed, honestly, that I would be a sports journalist of some sort because I was so passionate about sports and the people and the statistics, and I was so into all that stuff. I wound up obviously going a different route. I somewhat randomly worked for George Will in college, the conservative columnist. That led me to a job with Charlie Cook, the political handicapper, which then led me to the Washington Post and the CNN. So I just sort of went down this other path that I wasn't expecting. I was not the kid who was like the president of the Young Democrats or the Young Republicans in college. I was not Alex P. Keaton, right? It's a dated reference, but yeah. I was not that person. But I always kept this sort of flame alive of sports. I was always interested in it. I played very amateurly, but I played pickup basketball in particular. So I always sort of kept a finger in that pie. So when my editor came to me, and you can testify to this, Kate, sometimes they come to me and say like, hey, do you think there's another book in you? I knew I wanted to do something that I could be passionate about because I was concerned about writing a book just because it's daunting when they say, all right, well, we'll just need about 70,000 words and it's due in 18 months or whatever, 2 years. It's a daunting prospect. At least was for me as someone who writes, more. I write a lot, but usually much shorter than that. I'm not writing books as a day in, day out job like you are. It was sort of scary. And so I wanted to do something that I felt I had some expertise in, right? I didn't want to start from utter scratch. And so I felt like I knew enough about politics, certainly, and presidents, but also enough about sports that I wouldn't start from zero. Mm-hmm. So the seed of the idea, right? The elevator pitch of the idea was the sports presidents played, loved, and spectated, and what it tells us about who they were and how they governed. That was like the idea going in. Having never done this before, I candidly wasn't sure there were 60, however long the book wound up being, a lot of words, a book length to treatment for that question. We looked around and saw if there were other books like that. I started writing just to see how much we could do with each one. And it wound up being that idea wound up serving us well throughout the process, that as long as I kind of kept coming back to that, what I didn't want to do is just a bunch of fun anecdotes. I mean, that's interesting, but I wanted to say something more about, okay, well, what does it tell us about who these people were and are? So as long as I kind of hewed back to that, I felt pretty good about where we were. But honestly, when I initially started, I wasn't sure that it would wind up as a book. I thought, what I didn't want to do was write like my college essays. It's supposed to be, it's a 20-page paper that's really an 8-page paper that you've changed the margins on. I didn't want to be that. Yes. I didn't want to be that person. So I wanted to make sure it was a book length idea, and it wound up being that. So, but it all grew from my selfish desire to write more about sports and to be in that space.
I mean, it's fantastic because I will profess to not being a huge sports junkie, but
totally fine.
Yeah. But what you do is you talk about how their love of sports kind of manifests itself in how they steer the country, like what the sports that they like to play or engage in says about them. So, you talked about, I love this. You said that Eisenhower's ability to see all angles, plan out all eventualities, and deal with all sorts of personalities in bridge and in life was on display during his most famous hour, the planning and execution of the D-Day attacks. I would never think of golf and bridge and sort of the mental, skill that it takes to play sports and how it,
Totally.
like, is that one of the, because I honestly never really thought about it. What are a couple of examples of how the sports they liked? I'm just thinking about, it's funny that JFK is one of the least kind of sporty of the president.
Even though we have a perception of him that he was the most sporty and the most
So,
healthy and right.
yeah, but
Um, well, first on Eisenhower and Bridge. So it's sort of fascinating. Eisenhower was a card player throughout his life. He actually earned the money to buy Mamie Eisenhower's ring with money he won from poker games, which is
oh,
totally fascinating. Yes.
yeah,
Once he joined the military, he's played poker less and played bridge more. Now, I will admit, like, I don't know much about bridge.
yeah,
I learned some throughout this process, but what I read, it's fascinating how deep you can, as I'm sure you've learned in book researching and writing, how deep you can go down rabbit holes when you do this sort of stuff. There's a whole trove of literature about how bridge is the closest approximation to war that exists. That you're playing with a partner, right? And you're also playing with two other people. So you are signaling and telegraphing to your partner certain things by the way you move, but you could also be bluffing to throw off your opponents. That there's a lot of jabs and feints and that sort of thing that Eisenhower found sort of addictive during his to while away the hours while these massive engagements were underway. Um, he's not only there were a number of leaders, international and domestic, who took to bridge. That bridge was a sport that they loved. So yeah, I, I think that there's what I kept finding was in some ways the comparisons between the sports they played and who they were and how they governed was so spot on. It felt like a little awkward. So like Nixon loved to bowl.
yeah.
Now, bowling was a bigger deal in the late 60s and early 70s than it is now. It was a much more major sport. Fun bowling fact: the first athlete to be sponsored by a company was, in fact, a bowler in the early 1970s, which, again, I didn't know going into this book. I learned as a result of this book. But Nixon loved to bowl. He had bowling alleys installed in the White House. Um, he would go, by his own admission, he was talking to the press corps, he would go at 10 o'clock at night many nights and bowl 7 to 12 games by himself. Now, that image of Nixon, right, like our great loner president, the image of Nixon by himself, just rolling frame after frame in his suit and tie, or his shirt and tie, right? The famous Big Lebowski picture. Um, I think it's just so telling about who the guy fundamentally is. Bill Clinton, in college at Georgetown, he told a female friend of his, I'm paraphrasing, but this is very close to the direct quote. He said, "If I run for 30 minutes a day, I can eat all the bad stuff I want."
Oh, it told me
That was true. I
it
know.
told me.
If
Yeah.
only he had really hit on something there. But the idea inherent in that, I think, governs his whole life, which is if I do enough good stuff, I can cancel out the bad stuff that I do, right? That there's always these two sides to Bill Clinton. There's the one who runs and the one who loves fast food. Just one quick story on that. This is one of my favorite stories in the book. So when Clinton was governor of Arkansas, he would run out in the streets of Little Rock, and he would always finish up his runs at the same McDonald's where he would get food and eat there. And there's a plaque at that McDonald's in Little Rock that commemorates, like, this is where Bill Clinton would stop after his runs. But again, that idea that, like, if I run enough, I can outrun the bad stuff that I've done, it feels very on the nose to me. I think even Obama in basketball, I won't go on too long, but Obama in basketball, so Barack Obama meets his dad twice in his entire life. One of the two times he meets them is at Christmas when Barack Obama is 11 years old. His father comes to Christmas in Hawaii with his grandparents. Um, he gives him somewhat randomly, honestly, a basketball, which
Yes.
is sort of a weird gift in that at the time, basketball is not a big deal in the elder Obama's native Africa. It's a big deal now in the country, but it wasn't then. And Obama himself, Obama the younger, is not super interested in basketball at that time. But he writes in Dreams of My Father, he writes about how the basketball and he views it as sort of a charge, as sort of a message, like find a place where you can fit in, and basketball helps him fit in. He uses it throughout his campaign to try to connect with people who view him as other, right? A guy named Barack Hussein Obama with a Kenyan father and a white Kansas mother trying to run for president of the United States. He uses basketball as sort of his diplomacy, right? So I just kept coming back to, there were all these examples where the way in which these people were and how they used sports was so spot on to how they approached governance, how they acted in office. And again, I found that gratifying because that was the theory of the book, which I was always worried from the start that the theory of the book would wind up not being borne out, but it was.
I think it's just so fascinating that I didn't know that. I had assumed, because the famously Obama liked to play basketball on primary days, right? And the
Yep.
one primary he didn't play was when he
New
lost.
Hampshire. Yep.
Yeah. And then he played again, you have in the book, on election day 2016, which also didn't really go the way he
And
was
was one of the last times he played too. I talked to Reggie Love, his body man, who was a basketball player at Duke, who was great for this. But he was like the perfect person for this book. You know, had spent time with Obama, had been involved in athletics, helped organize all those pickup games. So I asked Reggie Love, like, what was the last time Obama was really good? You know, like last game he played, he was really good, and he mentioned that day, election day 2016. It's also one of the last days he played because Obama has basically gotten out of the pickup basketball business, at least in part at the behest of Michelle Obama, who I think was concerned about him injuring himself as he aged, like tearing his Achilles tendon or hurting his knee. So as a result, he's moved far more into, he plays golf a ton more now than he plays pickup basketball. Though they were worried throughout the campaign that he would take an elbow in the face or get a tooth knocked out or something, because he was, to your point, he was playing basically on the day of all these primary and caucus votes, where at night he would have to appear and give a speech and do all these sorts of things. There's David Axelrod, I talked to him, his advisor, and there's a story in the book about Axelrod like knocking him down in a pickup game, not intentionally.
right before a debate, right? Like
right before a debate.
Yeah,
exactly. And there was like real concern that maybe Obama would have a black eye in the debate. And so, you know, again, I think that the other thing we haven't talked about, but I do think that there's a competitiveness gene that is in a lot of these guys that makes you do stuff that you probably should do. The truth of the matter is Barack Obama on the day of a debate probably should be playing pickup basketball, but that's how he channeled his competitiveness. That's how he got ready for a debate. That was sort of his preparation. I mean, you know, you see it over and over again. George H.W. Bush, who I know you've written about in the past as well, he's just super competitive. Like his daughter Doro told me that as he aged, he would have competitions with the grandkids about who could fall asleep fastest. You know, like, which by the way is a great parenting tactic that I wish I had known when my kids were younger. But like, so they're just competitive people by nature.
And he played horseshoes too. You talk about that, which
I
got too. I love the horseshoe games. He played with the housemen at the White House, and it was so competitive that they would even have like T-shirts made up for the different teams. And at the end, they told me that they let him win. But that's another thing I wanted to ask you is, you're playing the president of the United States. Are you really going to beat him? Like,
and that's one of the questions I always asked. I asked everybody I could that question about Obama, because I was fascinated. As somebody who plays pickup basketball and has played basketball my whole life, one of the questions I was most interested in, just selfishly, was, is Barack Obama actually good at basketball? You know, because it's so hard to tell. And what I learned is he's probably like a D3 bench player. He's not. He's a pretty good athlete. He's left-handed, which is a huge advantage in basketball. Pretty good shooter, smart, sort of can fit into the game no matter what kind of game's being played. Is he as good as, you know, for his 47th or 48th birthday, I believe, he had an event where a bunch of NBA guys came and they played at Fort McNair in
Mm.
Virginia. Is he that good? No. I mean, he's not even close to good enough to be an NBA player, but he could run with those guys. He did the same thing in 2008. He played with the University of North Carolina basketball team before the North Carolina primary. Again, he's not good enough on a raw basis to play with them. But yeah, it's so hard to know how
Yeah.
good or bad these guys are at things. And that was one of my struggles because there are some objective guidelines. So Gerald Ford is clearly a very good athlete, right? He played offensive line at the University of Michigan. He was an All-American. He had offers to go pro from the Lions and the Bears, right? So like objectively, he's a good athlete. George H.W. Bush was the starting first baseman on the Yale baseball team and the captain. So again, objectively a pretty good athlete. Once you get beyond those two, it starts to get a little bit dicey.
Two of the people that we think of as like, Bush was criticized for kind of being weak, right? And then Ford was a punchline, and you write about SNL and how it made Chevy Chase famous, like the whole stumbling, the idea that he couldn't even, walk in a straight line kind of thing, dropping things and everything. And I think it still bugs the Ford family, because I've talked to Ford's daughter, Susan, about it, and that people do have a complete misunderstanding of how talented he was
you're 100% right. And I actually think some of that was Ford's fault. And I'll tell you why. So he's clearly I did 13 presidents. So I did Eisenhower to Biden. Is it possible Millard Fillmore was a great, maybe, but I didn't go back that far. It's hard because you start getting into sports that aren't played anymore, and that becomes a whole other thing. But clearly in the 13 that I looked at, Jerry Ford is by far the best athlete. I mean, it's not even close. Yeah. He's like an elite level athlete. Mm-hmm. I think that Ford was self-conscious about the idea that he was just a jock. That was sort of how he came into prominence. That was how people knew him. It was sort of the lead of his story. This is in the book, but Lyndon Johnson used to joke that Jerry Ford played too many football games without a helmet on. So this idea that he was dumb. And so as a result, I think Ford really downplayed his athletic prowess. He didn't talk about it. He was, no one knows. The guy's an incredibly gifted skier. He's one of the people who's responsible for basically turning Vail, Colorado into Vail, Colorado. Like they went and lived there. He skied there. He was in the phone book. People would call him up. Like he was like a citizen of Vail, and was responsible for a lot of that. They had a home there and was responsible for building it up in a lot of ways. He was kind of like the de facto mayor. But he didn't talk about it. He didn't really talk about his football career a whole heck of a lot, including seminal experiences he had. There's a guy named Willis Ward, an African-American player who was banned from playing when they would play certain Southern teams. And, Ford was very adamant that he wouldn't play if Ward wouldn't. They were roommates. He wouldn't play if Ward wouldn't play. And there's a lot in that story to tell, honestly, beyond just like, I was good at sports.
Yeah. You could write a book about it fascinates me that he gave, at the time he was offered this great NFL. I mean, wasn't he offered a spot in the NFL? And he
two spots.
Yeah. And so he turns it down to go to law school. Right. But now you write this, and never in a million years would someone do this. So that's
the pay scale was a little different back then. Yeah, I think, but yeah, I mean, made a conscious decision to downplay his athletic accomplishments when he pursued politics. Mm-hmm. I tend to think that was a little bit of a mistake. I don't know if Jerry Ford is elected today. I think he probably approaches it differently. We live in an era where the personal is so much more political than it was at the time. I mean, at the time there was like some reasonable expectation that you would have your personal life was your personal life and your public life was your public life. Now I feel like that division is totally eroded out. So I think Jerry Ford would be I always think of like, what does the Jerry Ford campaign ad look like, back in like when he's introducing himself, if he was running today. And, there's a big helping of, he was a really good athlete. I was reminded of so Ron DeSantis is going to announce for president sometime very soon. And they're already talking about the fact that he's a really good baseball player and that he played at Yale. And, so it just feels like nowadays it's sort of part and parcel of how you run for president is to tell that story. And if it includes sports, all the better, honestly.
Mhm.
Ford, in some ways, was the opposite of that. He had this amazing sports story to tell. But
Yes.
to your point, I did a thing this weekend, a book festival, and I asked people just in the crowd, if you've heard of Jerry Ford, what's your impression of him? Clumsy,
Yeah.
bad at golf, and like this is an elite level athlete. This is someone who played Division I football and had professional offers. But again, I do think that a little bit, if not more than a little bit, has to do with Ford and the way that he approached
Mhm.
his political career by downplaying his athletic accomplishments, which you usually see the exact opposite of that. You see people overplaying their athletic
Yeah.
accomplishments. Donald Trump, Bill Clinton. Um, in order to sort of make themselves more appealing to the average voter.
What kind of sports do presidents lean into the most? I mean, JFK didn't want people to know that he played golf, right? Because it was an elitist
Yeah.
sport. LBJ pretended to like baseball, right? To get Senator Russell to be his friend. Like
Yep.
they use sports in a political way. And I thought that was really interesting that there are certain sports like baseball and football that are really all American.
Mm-hmm.
And golf is kind of an elitist. And you write about pickleball a little bit there too.
Yep.
And I'm not sure if where that's going to fall because it's a bit of a country club sport, right? But
It is, but it's also a sport for older folks, which are prime voters. So I think the next president, whoever it is, will probably be photographed on a pickleball court at some point in the future, for that reason. But yeah,
yeah.
um, so Kennedy is, I think, a great example of this. As you mentioned, there's a guy at Golf Magazine whose job is swing analysis. That's all he does. He analyzes swings. So thanks to YouTube, I was able to send him video of every president that I covered swing. There's some footage of them swinging a golf.
Yeah.
And so I sent it to him and I said, can you just break down their swings? Just tell me like who had a good swing, who had a bad swing. And he said, by far, JFK had the best natural golf swing and was the best natural golfer. He said that in spite of the fact that JFK obviously had issues with his health and his back, which if your back is bad, it makes it hard to be good at golf. But yeah, JFK was very opposed to, and his family was very opposed to playing up his golf background because they still thought it had that whiff of elitism. And I'll note, he had been one of the Democrats who was extremely critical of the amount of golf that Eisenhower played when he was in office. So JFK had criticized Eisenhower for basically being the golfer in chief. And in truth, and I write about this in the book, Eisenhower did play a lot of golf, way more than Obama or Trump or anyone else in the modern era. He would take months off and basically go play golf in Colorado. So I think JFK is cognizant of that whiff of elitism. He's obviously already sort of closely aligned with sailing, which is another sort of elitist New England blue blood sport. So I think that's why you see them play up these touch football games. And the truth of the matter is JFK's health is so hit or miss that there's a number of times he's not even able to play in these games. I mean, he's so infirm. One thing I found fascinating that I didn't know is one theory about his bad back, which plagued him throughout his life, was that he played freshman football at Harvard for a brief period of time. And after one of the games, a family friend sort of jokingly tackles him from behind and hurts his back. And like one of the theories is that at least played some role in sort of the degenerative back issues he had throughout his life. But yeah, I mean, the truth of Camelot, obviously the perception and the reality we've learned were two very different things. Well, that is also true when it came to sports. Like the idea, I think they liked the idea of football because it was very much a blue collar, average Joe perceived sport. The truth is he was barely able to play. The other one that jumps to mind there is Nixon. So Nixon is like actually a genuine fan of sports to the on the verge of being a fanatic. He's sort of maniacal about what he knows about players and stats and numbers. He knows a lot, like much more than the average person does. But football in particular, he views as the sport of the silent majority, and college football even more specifically, he views as the sport of the silent majority. That this is this is where his base goes and watches. He goes to the 1969, it's called the Game of the Century, Texas versus Arkansas, both undefeated on national television. Nixon goes into the booth at halftime. Arkansas is winning. He predicts that Texas will win. Texas comes back and wins. Who's watching that game? A young Bill Clinton, who never forgives Nixon because he believes that Nixon jinxed his Arkansas Razorbacks team. But yes, Nixon, I think Nixon is, one of the more interesting. My two favorite chapters to write were Nixon and George H.W. Bush. H.W. Bush, for reasons we can talk about, he's just so competitive and sort of like definitionally a good sport. But Nixon, because he had these two sides to him, he was a real and genuine fan of sports. He was the kind of guy who would watch it on the weekends, unlike a Reagan, for example, who didn't really care, or a Johnson who really didn't care. At the same time, Nixon was a utterly political creature too, and he sort of understood. There's a memo that was written about college football that Nixon should associate himself as closely as possible with college football and the military, tied into college football because it was good for his politics.
Yeah.
So you can never really separate out. It's so hard. One of the biggest challenges is to separate out what did they do for political reasons and what did they do because they enjoyed going to sporting events. And it's very hard to tell.
Who had the best sort of relationship with professional sports players? Like I'm thinking of Schwarzenegger and Bush 41, right? But it always strikes me that presidents are most excited. When LeBron James came to the White House, I remember like Obama was so excited. Everyone was really excited. I mean, these are ultra huge celebrities. And even at the White House, there's a bit of an awe that they inspire in people. Are there some good stories? I know Arnold Palmer and Eisenhower, right?
Yeah, Arnold Palmer and Eisenhower were very, very close. Sort of, if you talk to people in the golf world, they essentially credit Eisenhower and Arnie with creating the modern golf world. That at the end of World War II, people had a few things that they had never had before: some money and leisure time. And they didn't really know what to do with either of those things, which is a funny problem to have. I would love to have that problem now, but at the time it was different, right?
Yeah.
And people were moving to the suburbs. Suburbs hadn't really existed prior to that. And Eisenhower and Palmer give the public an idea of what you can do, like that they go and play golf, and that was a thing that then became acceptable in the country. What's fascinating is even though it continues to keep this sort of whiff of elitism that has Kennedy worried about doing it, during the 50s, there are factories that have golf teams, and like it becomes, at least in part, a more blue collar sport. Again, partly due to Eisenhower and partly due to Arnold Palmer. Which I thought was sort of utterly fascinating that's the way that played out.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting when, and I think it will hopefully happen sooner than later, when we have a woman
Yes.
president. And did you think a bit about, is there going to be pressure on her to take up a sport? Or are women kind of given? I don't remember ever hearing Hillary Clinton talking about sports. And I think she might have bowled once in Iowa or something, but is this like an ultra masculine? I mean, you talk about Trump looking at sports as combat, right? And
totally.
wrestling,
100%.
like testosterone driven. And in that way, it's kind of a sort of antiquated, silly thing, in my view, to expect every president to be interested in sports. And maybe there will be a female president who's a great basketball player. I don't know, but it shouldn't be a prerequisite, right?
No. And the truth of the matter is, it's not I think that all of these 13 people went, with the exception of Johnson to some extent, who just didn't care. They all went out of their way to portray themselves as sportsmen. Now, portraying yourself as a sportsman versus being an actually good athlete are two very different things. The only people who were at all sort of like athletes in any way that we would think of, again, are Ford and older Bush. I'm fascinated by your question, though, and I did do some thinking on it because somebody asked me. Sometimes the questions you get after you write the book spark, things you wish you had put in the book. But somebody asked me, "Do you think it's possible someone, male or female, could get elected president now without being able to sort of speak the language of sports, which is a different thing than being an athlete, right?" I thought back to 2004 and John Kerry calling Lambeau Field Lambert Field, which was if you remember, was a huge
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
And him parasailing, which was seen as,
Yeah.
an elitist sport. And Bush ran ads at the end of the campaign where John Kerry is parasailing back and forth as a way to say he's flip flopping. And I wonder if that's true. I've sort of, through the course of this book, I've become convinced that there are two things that you have to at least pay some amount of deference to: religion and sports. And sports is a sort of religion in this country in and of itself.
Mhm.
But it's the same question of, could we elect someone who is an atheist,
Yeah. Yeah.
who comes out and says, I do not believe in God, as opposed to like they go to church every once in a while. Like, I do not think Donald Trump is a deeply religious man. I don't think Barack Obama was a terribly religious man. But they played the role of, they went to a church, they played that role. The question is, could you get elected if you were utterly uninterested in sports and had no ability to fake it? Again, Ronald Reagan was not interested in sports. To the extent he cared about anything, he cared about Notre Dame football because he had played George Gipp in a movie called Newt Rockne All-American about the Notre Dame football team. Like,
Yeah.
he was not a hugely he was not a guy who was watching sports on the weekend. He would horseback.
He rode horses. I mean,
He would
that's
horseback ride. He was sporty in that way, but he was not interested in sports per se. He was not a guy who was looking, this is again an antiquated reference, but opening the sports page in the newspaper and looking at the box scores. Like that was not a thing he did. He was not like Nixon, listening to games on the weekend, watching games on the weekend. But Reagan understood. I mean, one of the things that I love in the book is that Reagan was the guy who formalized bringing winning sports teams to the White House. Now, again, Reagan didn't really care. Reagan was not watching the NBA finals like really closely, or even maybe the Super Bowl all that closely. But what he understood was being close to elite winning athletes was a good thing for Ronald Reagan. You mentioned earlier, and I sort of skipped over it. I was come back to it. You mentioned who liked being in the presence of athletes the most. And I would say probably Reagan. There's all these great stories about how when the Lakers were very good during Reagan's presidency. So he would meet them. They would win championships fairly frequently. And he would always comment on how tall Kareem Abdul-Jabbar was and how he had to duck when he went in the White House, into the Oval Office. Like, he was fascinated by that. Reagan loved all the pomp and circumstance. There's great YouTube clips of him shooting a puck through a net that they had built outside the Oval Office, and shooting a basket and throwing a football. And there's
was he the president though? You were saying, I'm sorry, you just reminded me, in the book you write about a president who was showing John McEnroe how to hold a tennis racket.
Bill Clinton.
Okay, I think that is the funniest thing. Like, the hubris of that.
Terry McAuliffe told me that story that Clinton, Clinton always fashioned, just as a sidebar, Clinton fashioned himself as a better athlete than he was. I mean, he was. Mac McClarty, who went on to be his chief of staff, was sort of the athlete Bill Clinton always wished he could be. They're both from Arkansas. Mac McClarty was an all-state quarterback. Bill Clinton was in the band. Now, he was a very good saxophone player, but he was in the band at a time when in the football crazy South. But yeah, Terry McAuliffe told me the story of how Clinton sort of fancied himself an expert on almost everything, including tennis, which he played very, very briefly. He was not like an inveterate tennis player. He played on occasion, but yeah, showing John McEnroe a suggestion on the grip. I love that story.
I love that story, and I can't believe John McEnroe, because he would be the one person who would be like, "What the hell are you doing?" Right?
Get away
like,
from
he might get mad. Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought that was such a great story in the book, and the book is full of like little things like that just kind of reveal a lot about the person. And so I can't like not ask about Trump and Biden to get to the more recent presidents and how they are. It seems to me like I really knew nothing about Biden in sports.
Yeah. And he doesn't. So a couple things. One is, he's 77 years old. So he's not like super active as a sportsman at this point. Like, compare that to Barack Obama, who's in his 40s when he's president. Even Bill Clinton. These people are just much younger. I mean, Joe Biden is elected in his mid-70s as president. So he is not as active as some of these other guys, just by dint of actuarial tables. He plays golf relatively well. If you remember, he was part of a summit, John Kasich, who was then the governor of Ohio, John Boehner, who was then the Speaker of the House, Barack Obama and Joe Biden played golf together as sort of a bipartisan thing. Biden is, by the numbers, the best golfer of that group, but on the one hole the press was allowed to watch, bogeyed while the other three parred, which I think irked him. But I checked with Mark Knoller, who used to work at CBS News and is sort of the keeper of all these records of, how many times they played golf, where they've gone on vacation. And Biden had only played golf. The last time I checked with Mark, and this was post-book publication, but the last time I checked with Mark, he'd only played like 20 times total, whereas Trump had played 90 plus times by this point in his presidency. So Biden is not a terribly active golfer, certainly not in the mold of Obama or Trump.
And who's doing business, by the way, when they're golfing? Who uses golf? Like you mentioned the Boehner golf outing. Like, which president sees this as pure relaxation, and who sees it as like, I'm going to get a deal done here?
So Bill Clinton, definitely pure relaxation. I think Bill Clinton liked the idea. He talked about this, and this is in the book. He liked the idea of how long golf took because he liked to have that time away from the office. One of the things, the through line through all these guys is they all play golf. Some more, some less, but that's the one sport that they all played, all 13 of them. And I asked a bunch of people throughout the process, like, why golf? Like, why was golf the thing that always came up? And the thing that people told me in the responses were actually quite similar, was that golf is a sport. So as you know, having written about the White House extensively, like the presidency is effectively a gilded cage. You can't, there's a lot of nice pieces to it, but you can't really be normal. You can't go out for a run. Bill Clinton was the last president who would like run out in the streets. George W. Bush would chafe under the fact that he wasn't allowed to run out in the streets. They had a track built for him they didn't really use, et cetera, et cetera. But so you can almost never feel normal. And that these guys, the Secret Service is obviously still there when you're on the golf course, but they're not right in front of you. Maybe they're on the sort of the fringes of your eyesight on in the rough. You're out in nature. You can be with your friends, people you've known for a long time. And for 4 or 5 or 6, I guess, hours, depending on how good or bad you are at golf, you can feel somewhat normal. And I think that was very much the appeal for a lot of these guys. Now, I think that both Obama and Trump used golf to some extent for political reasons. Obama to try to outreach to Republicans. I think Trump, particularly internationally, would play with foreign leaders, particularly the Japanese. The one thing I will say about Trump is, when he came into office, and when he was running for office, he would say, I won't be like Obama. I'm not going to play golf just to play golf. I'm going to play to influence people. I'm only going to play golf as an influence. The truth of the matter is, like, 85% of the time he played golf, it was with people he was already friends with. He did a little bit of outreach in the same way that Obama did a little bit of outreach. But I would say most of these guys played golf for the fun of it. To the extent they got anything relationship-wise out of it, it was gravy, but not usually their primary goal.
You mentioned the Secret Service and the mountain biking that AMW did. And then he fell off the mountain bike at one point, right?
He fell off a bike twice. Yes.
What is the challenge? Another great story you have in the book, and some of these things really stood out to me, was about Reagan horseback riding with a Secret Service agent, and they would have them dress similarly and have the horses look similar.
How horses look similar, yes.
That if someone tried to actually assassinate the president, they would shoot the Secret Service agent, I guess, is the darkest interpretation.
That was the theory, yes.
It's kind of shocking to read that, but of course that's what they're thinking through. I mean, does the Secret Service kind of what kind of challenges are there? Finding a Secret Service agent who's a great horseback rider, right? Like, it's not like everyone.
Yes. I mean, they went through a number of, I think they realized that with Reagan, they realized, well, he's gonna ride, and he's pretty good at riding. So we can't just have someone who's can sit on a pony. Like, we need someone who knows how to ride. And they had to find a specific guy who grew up riding horses with his dad, who just happened to be in the Secret Service, who they elevated to this job. Same thing with Bush the younger, George W. He is one of the things I found fascinating about him is, when he goes running on the day after his 40th birthday party, where by his own admission, he had too much to drink. And he writes and talks about this later in his life, that he sort of reaches this crisis moment on that run, that either he can continue to live the life he's been living with drinking, or he can live a life that is different, and more health focused. He channels a lot. He has a bit of an addictive personality, Bush.
Mhm.
I think he channels a lot of that addictive personality into these endurance sports that he picks up later in life. So you mentioned mountain biking and running. He has this group at Crawford at the ranch in Texas called like the 100 Club, that are people who go running with him when it's 100 degrees or hotter.
Oh God.
He's and he does these 100-mile wounded warrior races on mountain bikes. Like, there's definitely a sort of addictive piece
Yeah.
to him that channels in endurance sports. But to your point about the Secret Service, yeah, I mean, look, Bush in particular is a good runner. Clinton was an okay runner. Carter was an okay, we're both fine cross country runners, but Bush runs fast. And so what I found so interesting was, it's not just you need someone who can run, but think about it. You need someone who can run at Bush's pace, who, in the event that someone attacks him,
Yeah.
has both the wherewithal and the endurance to fight that person off. I found that totally fascinating. So again, they had to do this sort of broadcasting to try to find people who fit that bill.
I mean, and they have to run presumably with guns or
Absolutely.
a weapon on them.
I
I
mean, I was totally. I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is not something that has come up in a bunch of my conversations with people. But I do think that that's a totally fascinating element of all this. That sort of secondary, the people who staffed these guys when
yeah.
they did their activities.
Well, I'm always interested in the staff. Like that's the
Yes,
people
I
who
love
are
it.
there, like seeing them. And I always wonder if the staff is like making small talk with them, or if they just want to be like, you go out there and run and don't say anything, right?
Well, one fascinating thing, and this isn't staff, but with Bill Clinton, you remember that running with him around Washington was like a very prestigious gig. And there's a quote in the book that it was, people say it was better to get invited to that than get invited to a state dinner, because it was just you one on one. There's also stories in the book of people who thought that running with Bill Clinton would basically be walking and talking, and that Bill Clinton took it very seriously, and that these people couldn't hang, and that after a half a mile or whatever, they would drop out and sort of
Wow.
like lag behind. So it was not the experience they had thought it was. But it just goes to show you, like, these guys, particularly Bush and Clinton, they were out for the exercise. These are competitive people by nature, ambitious people by nature. These are not people who run 20-minute miles. Like, if they're out there, they're going to run as fast as they possibly can. Particularly Bush, who I think was just driven by the nature of his personality to be sort of faster and faster and run in these difficult conditions and do these rides that other people wouldn't do, and this endurance stuff.
And I think you touch on this in the book, but a lot of that is stress relief from this job, right? They have the weight of the
Yes,
world on their shoulders, and runners often get, a lot of stress reduction from the endorphins and all of that with running. In particular,
absolutely.
one thing that really stood out to me also was Bush 43 being the first and only president to play Little League. I
I
had no
know,
idea.
right? Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's
I found
crazy.
Little League, the Little League of America is totally fascinating to me, because it was uh, they have incredible records.
Yeah.
So I talked to the Steve Keener, who's the president of Little League of America. I talked to him, and we talked about baseball, and for the first pitch initiative that Bush started in the White House and all that sort of stuff. But he had the actual roster for Midland, Texas, of George W. Bush, with George H.W. Bush as one of the listed coaches, that he sent to me. Like, they have rosters of every team that has ever played Little League, which to me, the amount of paper that involves. Uh, but
I
the
love that.
record is totally fascinating. So it's like Midland, Texas, and it's their home, which is now a museum,
Yeah.
that they lived in at the time. And yeah, I was sort of fascinated by that too, because baseball is sort of so
Yeah.
ingrained in our, like, America's pastime. But yeah, he was the first, and I think only one, because I don't know that anyone after him did. Donald Trump was a good baseball player, not as good as I mean, this is true of a lot of things with Donald Trump, not as good as he says he was, He has said he was the best baseball player in the state of New York. He was not. There's plenty of evidence to suggest he was not, but he was a pretty good baseball player. But I don't think he played Little League. He played in high school, but he did not play Little League. So yeah, it's sort of a weird anomaly, right?
Yes,
One
I was
fascinating.
totally stunned by that, you know?
One thing that's, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, if somebody was asking who's listening in on the chat, they said who started the presidents throwing out the first ball to begin baseball season while we're on baseball.
So I believe it's William Howard Taft, which is hilarious because Taft was like one of the least athletic obviously he was a big guy, the whole, like, he had a bathtub that could fit 6 regular people.
Yeah.
But I believe it was Taft, and until the 90s, maybe 80s, 90s, they threw it from the stands. So if you see any old timey, like if you see LBJ throw out a first pitch or JFK throw out a first pitch, they do it from the stands. Taft certainly threw it from the stands. It was only later in these last couple decades that they would go out on the field. And just while we're on the topic of first pitches, I feel like I have to mention this sort of the seminal moment. I think for most people, it's on the cover of the book. For people who think about politics and sports coming together,
Yes.
The thing that jumps out is Bush's pitch after 9/11, which is right. I mean, it's on the cover of the book for a reason. And I think for a lot of people, I went back and watched that clip and talked to a bunch of people who have been involved in it. And, it's really interesting. And I'd urge people who haven't watched it in a while, or if you watched it live, you don't really remember it, or you remember it vaguely, go back and watch it. It's readily available on YouTube. When he is announced to the crowd, it's very muted, his reaction. And I was trying to put myself back in that place in that moment. And if you think about it, it was a month after the attacks. It was actually not game 1 of the World Series. It was game 3 of the World Series. That Major League Baseball wanted Bush to throw out the first pitch in Arizona, where the first 2 games were played. And he said, no, I want to do it in New York. So it was actually game 3. But there were threats against the country. There were threats against Bush. He has a bulletproof vest on while he's out there. And there's a nervousness that you can hear in the crowd. He throws the ball from the mound, perfect strike, and you hear the crowd just sort of release. And there's, in that moment, look, it says it's much more than just a ceremonial ball thrown to a catcher before the start of a game, right? It says we've been knocked down, but we're going to get up. There's a resilience. There's a willpower there.
Well, they were considering canceling the end of the season, right? And
correct. They were considering canceling the entire MLB season, and Bush steps in and says no.
Yeah.
And I just think that moment, if you're talking about iconic first pitches, that moment really stands out. And that moment is one of the centerpieces of the book, just because of how much I think it speaks to. It's not just about sports. If it was just a guy throwing a ball over the plate, we'd all go home and we wouldn't remember it, 20 years later. But I think it's about so much more than that.
Well, I mean, sports is undeniably part of our culture, and America has a love affair. Like you said, I mean, I think you're right. I don't think we could have a president who was agnostic, or not really able to fake sports.
No, I think it would be really hard. And again, they wouldn't be the first person to fake interest. I mean, like you mentioned LBJ. I mean, the story in the book that I find utterly fascinating is he didn't care at all about sports. Like, there are all these moments when he was little where he's talking to the older men about politics while his friends are playing baseball together,
It's weird because he's like a big kind of gruff, huge guy. You would think he would be really into sports, right?
Very into manliness.
Yes.
Like, very into, like, I mean, there's this is obviously from Robert Caro's books, but moments where, he's like going to the bathroom and he's got his aides in there. Yeah. He has a nickname for his genitalia. Like, he views himself as a very manly man, but was not at all interested in sports, though, interestingly, a very good dancer and liked to dance.
Oh,
well, which I didn't know.
He was a ladies' man.
Right. He was a ladies' man. But there's one moment, and you mentioned it earlier, and I just want to flesh it out just for a sec. So he comes to Washington and he knows he wants to get close to Richard Russell, the senator from Georgia, the Senate Majority Leader, sort of the power in Washington. And what he realizes is 2 things. Russell's a bachelor, and Russell loves baseball. But Russell doesn't like to go to baseball games by himself because he's the Senate Majority Leader. He views it as kind of like beneath him to just be there, like keeping score by himself. So what does Johnson do? Johnson fakes interest about the fact that he likes sports and baseball in particular. So he goes over and over again to baseball games with Russell, and they build that relationship. Russell is convinced that LBJ is sort of a fellow traveler in love of baseball, when in fact LBJ could care less. And John Conley, who, you know, an LBJ aide who goes on to become the governor of Texas, would always joke with LBJ about, oh, you're really interested in baseball now, huh, Lyndon? Like, he just was not interested at all, but he used it for those purposes. And I think, you know, again, that's an example of even these politicians who didn't really care understood they had to fake it until they made it. Reagan is one. Johnson is absolutely one. Carter didn't do a good job of faking it, to his detriment. We haven't really talked about him much, but he was actually somewhat sporty. But again, the image we have of him is a kind of wimp, you know, weak. He did not do a good job of using sports, the medium of sports, to be able to talk. And of course, he's then followed in office by Reagan, who could care less about sports than Carter, but understood the perception piece so much better.
So another viewer is asking, are LBJ and Carter the only modern presidents who didn't play golf?
So they actually both did golf. The question is right, though, that they both were like very infrequent golfers. You know, at the top of the list, you have Eisenhower, and then you have Obama, Trump, Clinton, and then it sort of drops off from there. Johnson, interestingly, though, this is one of my favorite things about Johnson. So he's not in the sports. He doesn't really care. He would play golf on occasion. And this is so him, like just flouting, not caring about other people and flouting the rules. He would often hit 8 or 9 balls until he got a hit that he felt was right. So there would just be balls scattered all over because he was in his own world. Like he didn't really care about the rules of golf. He was much more focused on what's good for Lyndon Johnson. And what was good for Lyndon Johnson would be to just hit ball after ball after ball, which, by the way, he was not alone in doing. Bill Clinton famously would take, they called them billigans. He would famously take mulligans when he didn't hit a good shot. You know, Donald Trump is I don't think is breaking any ground here to say a notorious golf cheat. So several of them bent the rules, but I just love LBJ flouting it, like just didn't care at all about anyone he was playing with or anything else. He just hit ball after ball after ball. But the question is basically right. Neither of them were avid golfers by any means.
And Trump's use of wrestling, I mean, so much of politics is showmanship, right? And wrestling mostly fake, right? So, I mean, what is his, does he really enjoy wrestling? Is this something he really cares about, or is it connecting to his base?
So I think so. First of all, he and Vince McMahon, who is until very recently they sold it, but until very recently the head of World Wrestling Entertainment, are close friends. And Trump doesn't have a lot of close friends, nor does he have, I think, a lot of people he views as equals, you know, outside of his family. I think he views McMahon as sort of an equal. So I think he looks to McMahon at times. And I do think there were lessons learned, particularly in the way he campaigned in 2016, from professional wrestling, like outsized storylines ripped from the headlines, right? Like whatever had just been in the news, Trump was commenting on, like leading edge. He was commenting. It's very much in tune with wrestling. The idea that he still propagates, this idea that there's this group of people who are good, basically him and the people who support him, and then there are these people who are evil, who are trying to destroy the country. That whole, like, faces in professional wrestling parlance, faces the good guys and heels the bad guys, and that you cheer for these guys and you boo these guys, and these guys are unalteringly good and these guys are all bad. You know, a lot of that sort of black and white thinking he uses in his political campaigns. He's also featured in several storylines within the WWE in the 1990s. He's featured in 2 storylines, basically playing himself. But yeah, I think you would do worse to understand Donald Trump than to watch some professional wrestling. Genuinely, in that I just think there's a great book that's just out about Vince McMahon, which I would recommend to people, because I think in reading about McMahon, you come to understand a fair amount about Trump.
I know we have to wrap it up, but I am curious. Was there anything that like really surprised you when you were doing the reporting for this book?
I'll give you like a little thing and then a big thing. So the little thing that was just fun was I didn't know that Trump played squash in college. So he played squash his 1 year at Fordham. He plays squash. I talked to Mark Fisher, who wrote the Trump Revealed, the biography about him I used to work with at the Washington Post. I talked to him about Trump as a squash player, and he said he wasn't great because he was so impatient. Squash is a game of angles and thinking 3 shots ahead, and that Trump would just get annoyed and just whale the ball, which again is almost too spot on,
Yeah.
right? There's a story of Trump. They went to play at the Naval Academy and lost, and Trump wouldn't take the team bus. He would drive his own sports car to and from with his friends from the team. So after that loss, they go to a department store. He goes in, he buys a set of clubs, brand new clubs, balls, tees, and they go out over the Chesapeake Bay on their way back and just hit balls into the bay over and over again. And when they're done after about 45 minutes, they just leave the brand new clubs by the side of the road and drive off. It was almost too spot on. Donald Trump is, sort of like running through things recklessly and like what he leaves behind. So that was the little thing that I just found fascinating, because honestly, when I started the book, I did not think I was going to learn a lot about Donald Trump. Of all the presidents, I felt like I knew him the best. The bigger thing was that the thesis of the book, which is that these presidents, the alternate working title of the book that I liked, but my publisher didn't like, was called "It's Way More Than a Game." The idea being, it's not just about men on a field or women on a field playing softball or baseball or 11 people playing soccer or whatever. It speaks to something about our country and the people our country puts forward as its leaders, that there's an expectation that they can speak the language of sports, that they've played sports at some level, that they understand what sports means to people, that it is in fact about more than just this thing that is happening in a bounded time period where there's a win and there's a loss. And that the similarities between the kind of person who is drawn to being an elite athlete, the kind of person who is drawn to being an elite politician, and I put anyone who is president of the United States in the elite politician category, they have achieved far above their what expectations would be, that there are so many similarities: competitiveness, ambition, a desire to be sort of approved and loved, by the public. So that made me, that surprised me in the best possible way, in that, when you do have that initial germ of an idea, to see it bloom into what winds up being a broader book, I felt was really gratifying.
Well, it's a wonderful read. And, for people who love sports, they could really drill down and get into it. But even for people who are just interested in presidents and politics and history. So it kind of runs the gamut.
And I would put a pitch in. One thing I didn't want to do was write a political polemic. Like I had spent the last 5 years at CNN. Like, this is a book that, yes, it touches on politics because it's about presidents, but it's not political, right? It's not, you're a Republican, you're a Democrat, you don't follow politics, you're a Green Party, whatever. You should be able to enjoy this book for the stories and the history, as opposed to, I don't go through, Barack Obama saying, if you like your doctor, you can keep him, or George W. Bush in Mission Accomplished, or Donald Trump's many untruths. I really tried to keep it narrowly focused on sports and what it said about who they were as people, and what it says about us of why we elect who we elect.
Well, you did a great job, because it's not partisan in any way, shape, or form. So Republicans, Democrats, I mean, it's anyone can read it and be interested in it. So we have to end it. I could talk to you forever, but it's a fantastic read. It's so entertaining, and I learned a lot, and I had a little fun too, because like I said, I'm not a super sports person, but these are human stories.
That's right.
So I highly recommend. And thanks for asking me to moderate.
Thank you for doing it. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.